All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Keri Russell. I direct the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations. It's a pleasure to welcome you today. When the CIA first approached me about exploring the contrast or similarities between the world of espionage and covert action in real life and on screen through the lens of the Americans, I immediately said yes because, one, I'm a huge fan of the show, as I think many of us are, and two, I think the show does an amazing job of depicting Cold War America, the role of Russia, of course, which has become kind of prescient over time. And it was a great opportunity to kind of think these through with an interesting panel, which I will introduce in a moment. Before we jump in, I just want to flag something for the UCLA community. Tomorrow, in this room, on the subject of Russia, at 5:30, we will have our annual Bernard Brody Lecture on the Conditions of Peace with Congressman Adam Schiff. So Adam Schiff will be here again 5:30 tomorrow. I hope you all will come. At the Burkle Center, we have worked with the entertainment industry over the years in a host of different ways, but all in the guise of leveraging the power of entertainment as a gateway for people to learn about politics and policy. And this is an example. So many of us learn about espionage, spycraft, and so forth from television and film. And today's panel, which is jointly presented with the CIA, gives us an opportunity to talk with both real former CIA agents, people who have lived the version of things we see on screen, juxtaposed with those who write and depict it on screen. And the aim of this is to demystify the CIA's mission and the world of great power espionage generally by comparing those two and seeing what's similar and what's different. So if you're a fan of the show, you know that they excel in the Americans with like wigs and makeup. They're amazing at that. But they're also pretty good on the spycraft. And so we're going to talk about that today when we get the panel on. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in a moment. Let me just lay out a couple of ground rules. So first of all, feel free to take photographs. We encourage you, or you can post them. We encourage you to share them. Use the hashtag that's up there if you like, Real versus Real CIA. As many of you know, we at the Burkle Center often have a wide variety of voices on campus. That's one of the things we do. I believe strongly that a great university like ours should entertain a wide variety of voices in a respectful manner and engage intellectually with them. So I hope we all do that. We do have UCPD here in the event that that doesn't happen, but I'm confident that everything will go well. So with that in mind, for the Q&A, there will first be a discussion amongst the panelists. Then there'll be a Q&A. You all should have a packet. And in your classified packet, you will have a Q&A card. You can write questions down and pass them to the end of the aisle. They will be collected. Please keep your questions short and to the point. My advice is also write clearly so that they can read them. And then they will be passed up to Joe, who will be actually kind of moderating everything. So with that in mind, let me introduce our panel. So first, moderating today's event, someone who has kind of a rare insight into both of the worlds we're going to talk about. So Joe Weisberg is the showrunner for the Americans. He is a former CIA officer who served in the Directorate of Operations, Soviet and Eastern European Division. Joe, when he left the CIA, did not originally plan to write about espionage, but he did eventually. He wrote a novel. Some of you may have read that, TV pilot, and eventually The Americans. So please welcome to the stage Joe Weisberg. I'm going to recommend his novel as well as his show. His novel's excellent. A familiar face to audiences worldwide, Keri Russell has starred in many films and television shows. She currently stars in The Americans as Elizabeth Jennings. I think we all know that. For her performance, she received multiple Critics' Choice Awards nominations for Best Actress in a Drama Series, multiple Emmy nominations for Best Lead Actress in a Drama Series, and a Golden Globe nomination for Best Performance by an Actress in a Television Series Drama. As one of the KGB's top illegals or undercover agents living in America and posing as American citizens, Keri's character fights vigorously for her home country, sometimes at significant cost to her family, and of course to others. She's a stone-cold killer. Please welcome to the stage Keri Russell. Martha Peterson, known as Marty, retired from the CIA in 2003 as a senior intelligence officer with an extensive range of experiences over her 32-year career. She deployed worldwide as an operations officer, serving her first overseas tour in Moscow in the 1970s. Among her operational positions, she was assigned to the Soviet division. the Counterintelligence Center, focusing on analysis and counterespionage, and finally, the Counterterrorism Center, where she spent her last 5 years of her career managing the extensive operations surrounding the 9/11 attack on the United States. For her contribution to the CIA, she was awarded the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, the CIA's William J. Donnelly Award, and the George H.W. Bush Award in Counterterrorism. Marty is also the author of the book The Widow Spy, in which she recounts the first 7 years of her career with the CIA. Please welcome Marty Peterson. Matthew Rhys has earned rave reviews for his portrayal of Philip Jennings in The Americans, which he has also directed. Rhys has garnered nominations in this role for a Golden Globe Award, 2 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama. He's also starred 5 seasons as Kevin Walker on the ABC series Brothers and Sisters, and recently played Daniel Ellsberg in Steven Spielberg's film The Post. On The Americans, his character struggles with the role he must play in the fight for his home country and that of the new life he has made in America with his wife and 2 kids. Please welcome to the stage Matthew Rhys. Mark Kelton is director of MEK and Associates and a retired senior CIA executive with 34 years of experience, including more than 16 overseas. Mark concluded his career as chief of CIA's Counterintelligence Center. He was awarded the CIA's Distinguished Intelligence Medal, the CIA Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, the CIA Director's Award, and the 2015 Presidential Rank Award. Mark is also a regular contributor to the Cipher Brief. Please welcome to UCLA, Mark Kelton. Okay, and finally, Kosta Ronan stars as Oleg Burov on The Americans. He grew up in Russia, where he landed his first role at the age of 5. He later moved to New Zealand and Australia. He has appeared in the CBS sci-fi thriller Extant and had a guest role on ABC's Marvel's Agent Carter. In 2015, he filled an episode of Scorpion for CBS, The Player for NBC, and Agent X for TNT. At the beginning of this final season of The Americans, Oleg's character has left the KGB, only to be brought back into the world to possibly fight against it, leaving behind a wife and child he may never see again. We'll probably find that out tonight. Please welcome to the stage, Kosta Ronan. Joe, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Before we start, I want to give you one more reminder to submit your questions for the panelists on the Q&A cards in your packets, and I'll give you another reminder later to pass those down. Let me say, first of all, that since I left the CIA about 25 years ago, I've basically been waiting this whole time for them to call me and ask me to come back for one more mission. Admittedly, I thought it would be something a little more dangerous than moderating a panel.
Just you wait.
It's going to get crazy.
Okay, so we'll see what happens. We're going to talk about 3 things today. Tradecraft, which is, for me, probably the best word in espionage. It's a great word, tradecraft. Running assets or agents, and the emotional toll of being a spy. And we'll look at each of these things from the perspective of how we looked at it on the show, how we depicted it, and how it's done in the real world. So to start out, this word, tradecraft, as I said, fantastic word. Mark, can you define it for us? What is tradecraft?
Yeah, tradecraft is a term of art in CIA and in espionage. It's used by CIA, of course, but other intelligence services. And what it talks about is the means by which we actually conduct our operations or activity in the intelligence world. CIA, of course, does quite extensive training for that. If you're in the operations world, it is very lengthy and very, very stressful. We try to prepare people for the most stressful environments imaginable and give them the tools, because in espionage, as in many things, he who adapts fastest wins, and you have to be able to resort immediately to what you know in order to conduct yourself properly when you're under stress.
Okay, so the tools that spies use. I promise you guys this will be the only audience participation part of the whole show, but if you watch The Americans, of all the tools that the spies use, what is probably the one that got the most attention on The Americans that people talked about, laughed about, enjoyed? Wigs. Thank you very much.
I was going to say great actors.
So, Keri, for 6 years I haven't asked you this question, but I've wanted to know. I've gotten kind of mixed messages. You loved or hated the wigs?
I loved him.
You loved them?
Yeah. He's the one who hates him.
He complained about them
He's
a
a
lot.
complainer,
All right,
yeah.
so you go first. What did you love about it?
It's fun.
Yeah.
You know, the cool thing about getting to do that is it's so much easier to become a different person when you look so wildly different than, you know, putting on a short, you know, boy haircut versus a long blonde wig. People react differently to you, as I found out.
All right, then I'm not even going to let him.
Yeah.
Why is he always complaining about it? What could be bad about it at all?
I think you would complain that it's hot, right? It gets hot and it's itchy, but I don't know. I succumb very
I don't know. I find it hard to kick off this panel by complaining about wearing a wig. Sat between these two. Do you know, it's really hard wearing a wig. It's really hard. It's really stressful, actually. What do you think, Mark? Martha, chip in. Yes.
Is it the truth though? Were you like, did it take a long time to put on? Was it hot the whole time? I mean, you did these scenes. It would take 4 hours to shoot a scene. Were you sweating the whole time?
Yes, you sweat a lot. It's they glue the lace, so it's always sticky. I have a thing about sticky stuff on my face. Someone is forever poking your head, going, "Is it coming loose? Is it coming loose?" I was like, "Your teeth are gonna come loose in a minute if you stop poking me." Yeah, I'm not the most user-friendly when it comes to wigs.
Costa, those of you who did not get to wear wigs, were you always like, oh, we don't get to wear the costumes or the disguises? Or were you secretly relieved that you didn't have to sit there in the makeup chair for hours while they got put on and sweat?
Well, it's not entirely true. I didn't get to wear the mustache. That was a lot of fun, and I was dying to get into the wig game for.
Why not us? Why not me? I want to try this thing.
And but then once we tried the mustache, I thank God that I didn't get to do it more often, because it's kind of like we tried a few different sort of versions of the mustache, and most of them were kind of getting into my nose. So I can't do this all the time. But it was fun, like you were saying, because you kind of like, I don't get to wear it often, and when I was wearing it, and I was walking, I remember we were shooting in a hotel room, hotel sort of floor, and I was walking down the hallway, and I was saying hello to the crew, and people wouldn't say hello back. Mm-hmm. And that was incredible. It kind of taps into what you're saying, like people kind of just like, oh, I don't know, he's just like, how did he get in here? So it was a lot of fun. So on one side, it was terrific to be able to experience it. On the other side, it was even more terrific not to have to do it more often.
All right, Marty,
Yes.
we can handle the truth.
Yes.
You've seen the show.
Yes.
Are disguises accurate or ridiculous?
They were the best looking disguises I think I've ever
Right.
seen. I could tell it changed you, Keri. It changed your approach to what you were doing and what you were capable of doing as that person compared to you.
Right. Yeah,
That was a little evasive.
Yeah.
So was that ridiculous? That sounded like you were saying ridiculous. Best looking?
Best looking, but no, they were excellent and they really did enhance the show, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Mark, when do you actually use a disguise in the field? Why, when?
Okay, I was going to comment on the wigs and things. The thing that I'm watching the show, they were always very well put on. They were too well put on in that sense, because when you're actually working and you're an officer, you're putting them on yourself many times,
Yes.
and you're always worried about the damn thing falling off or your mustache peeling off at the wrong time. And but you look good in a wig. I mean, I don't know why.
Thank you. My new publicist. Yeah. Can I ask a quick question? How close to whomever you were talking to would you go when you wore wigs and mustaches or
Right.
facial hair? Would it be at a distance? Because if you were talking to someone who you can spot,
Right.
you know, so how close would you let it get?
You don't want to let it get too close, unless because frankly you appear like you're in disguise.
Right.
So it's for people seeing you from a distance.
Okay.
But if you have somebody sitting across the table from you,
You would.
that's not sustainable usually.
Yes.
I don't think.
6 years I said that. For 6 years I said that, and no one listened to me. Vindication from the Central Intelligence Agency. Yes. I
I rest my case.
All right. Mark, tell us about identity transfer. That's something we could never do on the show because it was too complicated.
Yeah, so, in the 80s, when I joined CIAs in the 80s, and I tell my students, there really was a Cold War, and I lived it. Identity transfer or identity change or operating in another identity was less of a problem than it is today. Because back then, it was the analog era. People would have to look things up, actually going to a library, finding reference material, finding other people to report on you, an agent or something. So, and the facilities that are used by security services and police departments were not nearly as sophisticated as they are today. Working in a false identity at that time was a little bit easier. Now, in the era of biometrics, Facebook, all the rest of that, it's really hard to sustain an identity.
Yeah.
Really hard. The problem is not so much at the point of attack when you're meeting somebody, it is all the backstory, right? So today, talking to students, and I tell them, don't put anything on Facebook you don't want found, because somebody will find it eventually. But you have to think about 5 years from now, right? So, your reputation is up there, but in an operational sense, you don't want to give away things about your identity that are going to be a problem 5 years down the line. So it's hard. It's a big challenge.
All right, let's discuss another piece of tradecraft that we did quite a bit of on the show, which is, let's talk about surveillance detection, two different things, right? Surveillance, you're following somebody. Surveillance detection, which you all did all the time in real life and on the show, you're trying to figure out if you're being followed. Do it in a car, you can do it walking around. I always got paranoid that people found this boring, partly because sometimes people told me they found it very boring, but I kept saying, no, nobody's ever done it right on TV. We have to keep shooting scene after scene after scene of it. Costa, you did a lot of these scenes walking down the street, no dialogue, you can't have any facial expression because you can't look suspicious. Was shooting these scenes for hours and hours boring, or was there anything interesting about it?
This is all news to me. I love that.
You love it?
Yeah, 100%. It's because it's just like in real life. What happens is you just so withdraw into yourself, into that world, and that is because you can't have a dialogue with anybody. You cannot express your thoughts. So you kind of are left alone with yourself, and that's the perfect way to exist in that moment. Just like in real life, when we kind of need to be in the moment and collect our thoughts, we're kind of like, I need a moment, and you walk away and you're there by yourself, right? So, but if you put the camera there, that's exactly what happens. And those are they were terrific. I loved them, absolutely.
Boy, if I were smart, I would just stop there. But what about you? Did you enjoy doing those scenes?
Did I enjoy doing at like 3 in the morning? No, probably not.
How about noon?
Noon, I liked it better.
Or we did most
Yeah,
of them at night.
most of them at
yeah.
night. A lot of spying happens at night, guys.
Yeah.
We kept trying to like get away from that, but it's just not as cool.
Marty, how often were you actually followed, or did you detect surveillance?
You know, I was in Moscow from 75 to 77, and I can pretty much say unequivocally I was never followed until the day I left Moscow.
No way.
The KGB in Moscow did not consider women to be a threat. And so I would go out from my apartment and I would drive away, obviously headed back to the embassy to a party or something like that. And I would look and I would listen. We had some very great technical gear that we used to detect surveillance. And I never had surveillance. And I'm sure after I was arrested and had to come home, they went and looked at the big book about, what has she been doing for the last 2 years? And
Whoopsie-daisies.
it was blank.
Wow.
Yeah.
And, when you're talking when you were in the Soviet Union, you ran a source there who was codenamed Trigon.
Yes.
And a pretty, crazy but probably not totally unusual thing happened, which is you were afraid that he may have been compromised because of tradecraft errors that you made.
Absolutely.
But there was no way for you to actually know. Can you explain why that's a problem with tradecraft, that it's possible to have that anxiety without ever being able to find out if it's true or not?
Yes. We make a plan and we follow through on it, And from all appearances, everything we see around us is as it should be. So you put the drop down or you pick the drop up and you return home, and you have no indicators whether it's gone well or not unless the agent makes a signal to you. And so at the end, when I went to make the drop and the KGB were there waiting for me, I then left and went home without ever knowing why it went wrong.
Oh.
And I spent 7 years thinking that maybe it was a gaffe. Maybe it was something that I had done en route to one of the drops, or in fact I had been followed and I didn't pick up on it. And it wasn't till after 7 years we realized it was an agent who had compromised Trigon, another agent of the KGB. Yeah.
When you were making those drops or picking up drops, can you explain the kind of state you were in were you trying to suppress panic and abject fear, or were you very controlled about it all?
You know, I admit it, I'm an adrenaline junkie.
Right.
And you know, adrenaline is the most wonderful drug in the world because it enhances every bit of your perception,
Right.
your hearing, your smell, your sight, movement, everything. You really do see it all. So my process getting to the site was always full of that
Right.
perception
Right.
and understanding. I also knew the city of Moscow better than any city I've ever lived in before or after, because I had to know my operational environment. I had to know what was normal and what wasn't normal for that area.
Right, right.
So I was never afraid. I was always high on adrenaline.
Wow.
And I was always, looking for what wasn't right, the abnormal.
Right.
And that would have been my key.
Right.
Mark, what about you? Did you feel the same way? You did this all over the world.
Sort of working in that kind of environment. I've worked in a lot of heavy surveillance environments where I was under a lot of surveillance.
He was male.
Yeah, denied.
Oh, he is male.
I used to be. You let my secret out. Yeah, so, and for me, it was alternately thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling in the sense that you're beating the opposition in their own backyard when they're holding all the cards, right? And there is no feeling like that, to actually defeat a very professional opposition. Terrifying, though, in the moments up to the operational activity, and then, as Marty says, afterwards. The problem with operations is frequently you don't know how they end up. It takes a long time for the story to play out. And one thing about if you're in human operations and you're dealing with human beings at the other end, you feel a compelling obligation to that person. That person has put everything they are in your hands. I mean, have someone look at you, look in your eyes and say, I'm trusting you with my life, keep me alive. And that is something that is palpable when you're out working. So when Costa was saying you get into yourself, you do. Actually, when you're out walking, you're out working to try to detect surveillance, you do get into yourself as professional discipline takes over. But just underneath that is fear, and fear can drive you in a positive way too. You want to make sure you're doing things right, you're doing everything that you've been trained to do, and do it as well as you can.
And you just hope that when time comes, it kind of just kicks in on autopilot, right? It's just like, that's what you were saying earlier, all that training comes in handy, because at some point you can't just think about what options you have, it's just the right one has to.
But that's the thing about the show, you're doing a lot of operations. We would never be able to sustain that pace of operations. It takes hundreds of hours of preparation to do these activities, right? If you're going to meet an agent that's going to provide you with crucial information, there'll be a lot of people involved, a lot of planning and a lot of preparation, a lot of what ifs, If this happens, what happens? And a lot of stump the dummy questions. So if he does this, what do you do? Does that, what do you do? Very thorough planning, very thorough planning.
That's what I said for 6 years.
This is why I said yes to do this.
It's finally getting even.
Yes, yes.
Well, Mark, let's talk about those human operations you're talking about. Can you explain, I'm going to keep turning to you for definitions. Can you explain what an asset is?
You asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So CIA officers, we call ourselves officers, case officers if you're in operations. What is a case officer? We call an actual operation is a case. A case involves an agent, the file of that agent. So you're a case officer. You handle agents. Agents are the foreigners at the other end, the people that CIA has recruited or has come to CIA to work, asking to work for the United States, that deliver us intelligence. The goal of CIA, of course, the ultimate purpose for CIA existing is to deliver secret intelligence to the president and leadership, to allow decision making. And the agents out there are the people that are the instruments through which we do it, and the goal is to keep them alive and to protect them.
So on the show, we did the same thing, just
You
for
did.
the KGB,
Yeah.
and the people had all kinds of motivations, the same ones
Right.
that they would have working for the CIA. So, Keri, for example, did you find the stories were better if the person was working for you or giving you information because it was for love, for sex, for ideological reasons, for money? Like I was thinking about Jung-hee, she didn't know what she was doing at all. She really just wanted to be friends.
Right.
But Don, her husband, was also trapped by you really just for sex. Like, did you find stories were richer based on what the motivation of the character was?
It's interesting. I mean, they were all interesting in their own way. I think their levels of need varied, obviously. I mean, I enjoyed them all in their varying degrees. I enjoyed the really involved ones, but I enjoyed the really simple ones too. And I think, and maybe Matthew could speak a little bit more to this, but it more affected, I think, the guilt you sort of have at a certain point in affecting these people's lives, especially, like with the Martha character. I think it comes into play a little bit more. But there was not one thing I enjoyed more than the other. I mean, it's all kind of great.
They all got to play
Yeah.
the different sides.
Yeah.
I mean, Martha was literally in love with you. That certainly, that kept going for years and years. We could certainly get a lot of story out of that.
We've only just met, Joe.
You know all about it.
Yes, and that from a human aspect, that's what was interesting to me. Is, and I'm sure it'd be, you could speak to a greater effect about when you were using. I mean, we're talking about when you use assets that are, they want to be active or
Right.
in helping, whereas Philip was using someone unbeknown to them.
Right.
Does that go on?
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Sure. I mean, the people will volunteer to come to work.
Yeah.
Come to work. Those are easier to deal with, of course.
Yes.
And then otherwise, you manipulate people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the job.
Yeah, and I think dramaturgically that was interesting to see someone deal with the guilt of using someone unbeknown to them. I think for drama, it was an incredible vehicle.
The one thing about the show, the sex bit is used a lot. That's very rare in my experience in espionage.
That's showbiz. Yeah.
Unfortunately for
You
me,
had to make
when
a
I was
TV
younger,
show.
the reason is, that blackmailing people generally is not a good way to have a good personal relationship with someone, right? I'm not just half joking on it, but if you want somebody to go in and do something very dangerous for you and work with you, and you're compelling them to do it, that's not sustainable over time. People resent it very deeply.
Although the U.S. did do it, right? I mean, it was done sometimes.
Yes, sure. It had done a lot by the KGB. Yeah. But I'm talking about in CIA's posture and a little different. KGB had a different viewpoint on it, and they would use it quite a lot.
Marty, what were some of the reasons assets spied for you?
Well, Trigon spied, he in fact volunteered for the CIA. He didn't like his system. He didn't like having to follow rules. He really preferred the Western way of life. And this was early 1970s when life in Moscow was pretty barren and lacked a lot of the opportunities that he had. He also I think, appreciated the fact that we appealed to his ego and to what he could provide to us. And that is one of the motivations. You make sure someone
Ego.
trusts you, and then you appeal to their desire to be the best, to be better than their boss, who maybe was not approving of their work. And so I think the positive aspects of attention is often a very clear motivator.
That's interesting. Jack Barsky,
Yeah.
who was an illegal, and that's the exact word he used, is the KGB appealed to his ego in recruiting, and that's what.
Yeah, because I said, why did you
That's
do
what
it all?
I
And I was
know.
like, why? Why? And he said, because it
My
was all
ego.
ego. I
And
thought I
yeah.
was the most special
Yes.
person,
Yes,
the only person who could do this.
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
How did you make sure that the person you were running was not working for both sides at the same time? How did you know that, when a person volunteers
Right.
or comes into to the party, how do you know that they're not really, it's not like a Trojan horse that's kind of like letting you believe that, you're doing all the right steps in terms of recruiting them, and they're feeding you information that is going to mislead you in a way.
Well,
and
you-
it takes maybe years to discover that.
Yeah, you don't know if someone volunteers to. You don't know what their motivation is. So you begin by testing them.
Right.
And you direct other sources of information sources you have against them, find out about them, and then you test their activities over time. You look at their information, see if it's logical, who they claim to be, whether they would have that kind of access to information, how they behave. But frankly, you have to do that constantly. There's no end to it. It never ends throughout the relationship, because after you do a meeting with someone, the next meeting, everything could have changed.
Exactly.
And it does change. The ego bit, so we were taught in training, the old school, since I'm part of the old school, was when you're looking at a target, you look at money, ideology, coercion, ego, mice. So those are the things that you look at as potential motivators, basic motivators, as how you're going to prosecute the target. Look at somebody and say, okay, do any of these things work? And ego, money is obviously a factor with a lot of people. Ideology in Soviet times was a big one. You had people like Trigon who were essentially ideological defectors. They were disaffected from their own system. But ego is constant in virtually all these things. People that decide to be agents aren't normal people, and they want to see themselves as special, and usually they are special.
Also known as actors.
Yes, ego.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's move on and talk about something very fundamental in the world of espionage, which is really the emotional toll that it takes on people to spy. And let's start by talking about how you balance the need to lie in a job that obviously requires lying with fundamentally remaining an honest person. And is that even really possible? In the CIA, you lie abroad, you lie in parts of your job, but really you don't lie inside the CIA, right? That's the kind of clearly defined boundary. But there's also kind of a gray zone, right? You have to lie to friends about what you do. You lie to some people in your family. And I remember when I joined thinking I was going to have a lot of trouble with that. And then it was like one day after 1 month in, something just clicked, and suddenly I could just do it. It was became second nature, and it wasn't even a problem after that. And I was wondering if you guys had any issues with that, the adjustment, having to lie to people when you first joined the agency. Was it easy, hard? I'm not talking about your family and your kids, which we'll get to later, but just friends and suddenly having to lie a lot. Marty, was that hard for you when you first joined up?
Not really, only because I had lived in the Far East. I had lived kind of a false true life where I looked like a spouse and worked a job. But when I got back to the States and I had to deal with lying about why my husband died, I had to kind of lie about why we were even in Laos when we were. That was very hard because you see, there was an emotion inside of me that was screaming out loud saying, I just lost someone, I'm 27, and he died for a purpose and a cause, and I could not do that. So I had to kind of downplay that and become a normal person with, even deny that's was part of my life.
Right. What about you, Mark? What about making that early transition?
No, I never had any trouble with lying, actually. I'm serious about that. You know, when you join CIA, we don't say it's a job, or those of my generation, it was a calling. And it's not suitable for everybody. And when you go into the organization, you join sort of a secret world, and we don't lie to each other, but lying for a higher cause is expected and acceptable. And I never had a problem with that. Ethics in espionage, though, is a big issue, right? I mean, because you're working in a secret world, you have amazing authorities. How you deal with them is something CIA takes very, very seriously. How somebody deals with those authorities. It's not what's not covered in the show is how much even the KGB spent a lot of time documenting their activities. You all would have spent some of these things that you did. You'd have spent days typing. I mean, really. I mean, it would have gone on and on. But for a CIA officer, there's probably no, especially a CIA operations officer, I can't think of any profession that is actually better documented. You would be amazed at the degree of detail that goes into cables, self-assessment. If you make a mistake, you're expected to say, I made a mistake. Even if it's a lethal mistake that you caused the compromise of an operation, you're expected to come back and say, I made an error. And we hold people to those standards.
We used to, quite a bit on the show, talk about the fact that it was possible to relate to these characters for anybody, because really everybody, all of us in our lives, we hold things back. We keep things to ourselves, even if we don't, call it lying all the time. They're things to relate to. Costa, did playing this part cause you to think of yourself differently, to notice more when you were telling white lies or lying to people, or think differently about any of those parts of yourself?
Absolutely. And it was interesting hearing you speak right now, because one of the most fascinating things about espionage, and I guess that's something kind of like that as actors we discover every single day, is how do you remember who you really are?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
With actors, we're kind of like, we know who we are, we're discovering ourselves and as we go through life, and we're learning new things about ourselves, and as we take over the character, we kind of tap into certain parts in ourselves. Right. But with spies and with that sort of world, secretive world, where every single day or days on end, you have to kind of pretend you are somebody else, yet remember, like in your case, who you really are, and come back home and grieve the loss of your husband, and you cannot share it with anybody. And yet the following day you go out, you put another wig, and you put on another profession, and you go and you do what you got to do. How do you? Can I ask that question? How do you remember who you really are? That core of who you are, who you were when you joined the agency.
Part of it is right brain, left brain. That's how I always pictured it. I kept one side was my secret place, and one side was my real place. And when people say, well, why didn't you just blurt out secrets? And, well, you don't, because you kind of close the safe at work, you dial the dial, you lock it away, and then you become who you are.
Right.
And there was a gray area there for me, because I really didn't know who I was when you lose your husband that young. And then you start developing again, your own true persona as much as you can,
Right. Because it's interesting, during the Second World War, a lot of, I guess, Russian female spies got caught, illegals in that respect, is because when a woman gives birth, she screams in her native tongue. And that is how a lot of them got caught, because they were infiltrated, they had perfect German, everything was, nothing that would give away. And then, they would give birth the way, you would give birth to Paige and Henry, and they would scream in their native tongue. And that's when, they got caught out. And there's a number of cases that happened that way. So it was quite interesting to see how it's done in today's world, especially being a female in that field.
Marty, you wrote this wonderful book, and you talk about your husband who died, and you talk about the kind of amazing day when you told your kids the truth about what you really did. Will you tell us that story?
Yes. My children always thought that I worked where their father did. and he worked for the State Department, and I never made any comment about it. I got up in the morning, got them off to school, and then I would go to work, and then I would come home, and it was daily life for us. Well, the Discovery Channel had developed a new show, and one of the episodes had a picture of me.
Oh my gosh.
Well, we had just come back from
Oh
overseas,
my
and my children were 15 and 16, and my son was addicted to the Discovery Channel. And I knew one day he'd be sitting there going, Mom. So it was Good Friday. They were off of school. I had to work, so I called him and said, I actually left a note on the counter. Please meet me at the Roy Rogers restaurant in McLean, Virginia at 12 o'clock today. So they drove up. My son could drive, drove up, got into my car. And what's up, Mom? And I said, I have something to tell you. I said, Mom, I don't work for the State Department like your dad does. I work for CIA. And my daughter said, what's that? And then my son said, Mom's a spy. And that couldn't have been scripted.
Right.
It couldn't have been. It was the
Right.
true deal. So I took them into the agency
Oh
then,
my gosh.
stopped at the guard booth, got them visitor badges. They were so thrilled by this, still unbelieving. And then we went into the agency and walked down to the memorial wall, which was very special to us. And of course, my husband, my first husband, has his star there on the wall. And I showed them the star, and they held on to my hands and realized the emotion I had and who I was. And they had not a clue about this. It was the most really remarkable moment for me with my children. And then I bought them lunch and a T-shirt, and that was it.
It's so similar
But did
to
they
Paige.
believe you?
Yeah.
It's so similar to the way Paige reacted.
A little different?
Yeah, just slightly different. Theirs ended so well.
Right. Much happier ending.
Yeah.
Well, Marty and I were talking about
That's
this on the phone.
amazing.
Everybody reacts differently. You hear
Right.
a lot of stories, and different kids have very different
Right.
responses.
Yes, I do.
But-
Right. that's
So
true.
we just have a couple more questions just before we do them. I want to just remind everybody to pass your cards out to the outside aisles with your questions.
Oh.
Mark, what about telling your kids?
Yeah, so that's a struggle for all CIA parents, right? If they're in the operational field, they're in the secret world. At what age do you want to tell your child? And you want them to be mature enough to handle the information. In my case with my son, we were forced into it because we were overseas and he went to a local school with other American kids. And somebody had told those kids, or one of those kids, that I did secret work, and he was getting questioned at school. So he came back and he's asking, the kids at school are saying that Dad's a spy. So we had to sit down. He was 11. We sat down with him, and my wife explained, to do the secret work, we have to keep quiet about it. And he works for CIA, of course, but you can't go around talking about that, and you can't say anything about that. So he looks and he kind of hoists it on board, and he shakes his head. And about 3 months later, he comes back over breakfast. He says, so what are those 3 letters I'm supposed to forget? And my wife, and my wife looked at him and said, well, if you can't remember, I'm not going to remind you.
It's so good.
But the emotional issue, the people that work at CIA in the secret world, they're people just like you all. They got families and all, and they have to live their lives at the same time, and there is great strain. I think the show depicted a lot of that quite well. The family strains and the difficulty. You have people that are out doing operational things. They can't explain many times to their spouse and certainly their children why they're going out every night and doing work and why they're staying so long at the office. And, when we started, of course, it was the Cold War. The modern generation, since 9/11, have been incredible stresses since the War on Terror, where people are deployed all the time, their families are separated quite a lot. It is a tremendous toll, and people are great patriots that are out doing this. But it does take a toll on families and on them.
You know, Keri, well, first of all, I sort of wish we'd done the Page scene in Roy Rogers. I think that's,
I mean,
we did do scenes in Roy Rogers.
I
We built a Roy Rogers.
Amazing.
That would have been kind of great.
yeah.
But
Amazing.
you know, when Paige did confront you guys that night, that was pretty tough. I'm not saying it's tough as the real thing, but it was pretty tough. Has that storyline and everything that happened on the show, has it had any effect on your parenting? I mean, in a weird way, it has affected mine. Maybe that
In
sounds
what
weird.
way?
Well, I'm infinitely aware of how much I lie to my daughter. It turns out I lie to my daughter constantly. I just think if you have kids, I don't think you can raise a kid, a young kid especially, without lying to them all the time.
Yeah.
Which I didn't know before this show.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is amazing. Also, but I just think they know everything.
Do you? Do you
I
think they-
do. I mean, I think they're listening so much more
Yeah, they do.
than you really
They-
think, and I think they are perceiving things. I think they do know. I mean, we had this experience about 6 months ago. Matthew and I had been discussing something for a long time. This one specific subject, and we allow our 11-year-old to have electronics on the weekend, and he has like headphones, so he gets like special iPad time or something. And we often would have this discussion about this thing that was happening, but he was like in his game or whatever, and you'd be like, River, take those things off, listen to me, you know? So we were fine, we would have our discussion, and then recently we said something like, oh, I know, but that thing, we don't know where it is, and River from across the room went, I thought it was in Seattle. We stopped dead in our tracks. We're like, what? And we're like, how long have you been listening? But I think they know, I think they know everything.
That was always the idea of that storyline, was that the kids know everything. They may not know it exactly literally.
But they like feel
they
it,
know
they
everything.
smell it, they
Yeah,
smell
they
it.
do.
Because you tell them in other
Right.
ways, sort of. So maybe that's why your kids took it so, I don't know, maybe there was something that they sort of innately knew.
Maybe.
One thing about the show, you all are playing KGB illegals in America, in conversations in your house. That probably wouldn't happen
No,
in real life.
no.
Right.
Turning
I
on the
could-
water
yeah,
isn't
yeah,
working.
it- Turning on the water, turning on the TV, turning on the radio,
You're like,
everything
"No, no,
trying
no,
to drown it out. No, really, it's an issue with families because you don't want to, when you go overseas to a really hostile environment where the adversary has access to your apartment, as in my case, every room in my apartment was wired. There was video in my bedroom, all the rest of that. You could deal with nothing that was private. And if you had a conversation, it went immediately to the adversaries. So you'd be very, very careful. So that's an added stress, that really is. And it's something that is very hard to live with.
Can I ask you something? Because I was reading, there was a journalist recently,
Yes.
a British journalist who was talking about that,
Yeah.
who had been writing there and was saying, he lived there with his young child and wife. So you're having sex and they're listening, like, isn't that weird?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean,
But like you gotta do it, so you do?
it's either that or no sex.
That's so weird.
So I mean, you just sort of enjoy the moment, and if they say something, you tell them to send postcards. I don't know. Really, I mean, you got to live your life.
It's amazing.
But it is strange.
Strange.
It is strange. Yeah.
And I guess you can't let anybody know that that the place is wired.
No,
right?
you
So
can't. That's
you
the
kind
whole
of
thing.
have
You
to
just got to live
pretend.
so what you'll work out usually is some sort of motions. We'll go outside in the garden or something and have a conversation, or got to go to the embassy and have a conversation. So that kind of thing. The other thing is you can't leave like written material or anything around your apartment or your house because that all gets fixed up too.
Wow.
And then if you get harassment and people really don't like you, they can make life very difficult. Yeah.
Wow.
All right, well, let's go on and take some questions from the audience. First one is from Christina to Marty. Marty, you mentioned the agent you worked with, Trigon, was compromised. What happened to him?
What happened to
Yeah, I
him?
know it's a tough question.
Yes.
but-
Well, when he was compromised, the KGB first went into his apartment and put cameras in his bookshelf so they could observe him when he came into the apartment. And finally, they couldn't act like him because I didn't have all the pieces. So when he came into his apartment and he was looking at some of his spy gear, the KGB came through the door and arrested him and said, tell us what you've been doing. And he said, give me a pad of paper and a pen and I will write a full confession. And what they didn't know, of course, was the pen that he had there on the desk had an L pill in it, a lethal pill, poison of sorts. And Trigon had requested this L pill as a way of avoiding a bad end, not of his choosing. So he started to write with the pen, and then at a certain moment he put it into his mouth, he bit down, and he committed suicide right before him. I mean, I can tell that story very calmly, but I have to tell you, when I heard it a couple of years later, it went to my heart because I had provided that pen with the poison. And it isn't a normal activity. It's certainly not something I was trained in. But I also knew that he wasn't going to be taken to the basement of Lubyanka and shot in the back of the head, which was what happened to most of our agents who were compromised. So that's what happened to him.
Keri, your character's choices put her children's safety at risk. Was Elizabeth right to prioritize her ideals in her career choice, or should she have attempted to defect after her children were born?
Well. Well, I mean, I'm only coming at it from, a fan of a story, But I think she absolutely did the right thing. I mean, one could also argue that she was a really good soldier, and by being the best possible soldier, she's keeping herself and her family safe. By defecting, I mean, that's a different danger. I don't know. But I think she did what was right for her. And I loved the choices she made.
I'm with you. She's got a whole country to defend.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
I also felt that you played that role so consistently. Your commitment to the motherland was so strong, and it never wavered.
It never wavered.
Except once, when you were in the closet looking at your shoes.
I was like, do I want to leave these?
And that's what I felt it. I'm
like, these are good
we're
shoes.
Leaving here. Can I leave these shoes behind?
I love it. It's so true. I was like, ooh, not that pair. Isn't that true? Isn't that good?
It was so true.
Oh, I loved how Chris shot that. It was so, so beautiful. Mark, what was it like to leave the CIA and return to normal life? This question presupposes that you've returned to normal life.
Yeah, you see, I'm not sure I knew what a normal life was as an adult. I mean, I went to college, went to University of New Hampshire, then I went to graduate school, to Fletcher School. I joined CIA as an analyst, but I never worked as an analyst. I was going to be a Soviet analyst, and I was in training, and they said, would you like to do operations? I had never been outside the United States, much less even considered doing operations. I had no idea what operations were. Having a normal life presupposes that I'd actually established myself and understood what life was outside of the secret world, and I really didn't. I grew up really and came to full maturity in the secret world, and had to do it quickly. So now I'm leading a semi-normal life, although as a CIA retiree, you never really retire. You don't. I mean, 34 years, I was in a long time. It is a very close family and people that have lived and worked together for years and under very stressful situation. That can't be duplicated outside and will always be with me. And Marty and other people, we're always a very closed fraternity. And I think events like this are good because we can talk a little bit about that to people. I mean, the thing that I always tried with my young officers, and invariably people don't realize this, but the people that actually do the work at CIA, the bulk of the work, are very young. They I talk to them about the responsibility of serving their country, right? And that is the principal motivator for these people. If you ask them, they'd invariably come up for that. Just the willingness to serve. So, yeah, having a normal life, I'll never have a normal life, however you define that. I'll never have one. And I'm happy with that, by the way. Yeah.
I'm going to toss this out to Matthew and Costa. Can you guys talk a little bit about the preparation you did for the roles and what you struggled with the most?
You go first. No, you go first, and I'll try and better your answer.
All right. Lots of reading.
What did you read? Do you remember?
Yeah, no, because the list. So here's the thing. To me, it was because obviously I wasn't coming in like you guys to do the show. I was coming in to do an episode.
Right.
So what was important to me is to figure out how he thinks and what he thinks about. So to understand how the person thinks, you need to know what the person knows. So you would read the same books as he would read. You'd listen to that music. You'd kind of, at that stage, I didn't have an opportunity to go and talk to anybody because I thought I'm 2 weeks and I'm out. Over the years, though, as you know, the role progressed and the show kind of kept on going, obviously we had an opportunity to go and talk to the people on both sides, here and there, people who worked for the FBI and CIA here, people who worked for the KGB, people who worked for both. But what was important to me was to know what he knows and to not know what he didn't know and to keep him in that bubble. So, when you have a conversation, you don't just say what's on the page, you don't just say what's written out. It's always a response to what you hear, right? And the response is motivated always by what you're thinking. So for me, it was really just like an onion. You have to peel those layers to get to the core, to figure out what the core is, and then build those masks on top of it. So that's kind of how I approached it. And it's understanding the psychologically of why the person does something. That's what was very, very important to me.
Did you ever feel like you had a different perspective from everyone else because you're Russian, and not only are you Russian, but even the other Russians, in a way, you have a different Russian background from the other Russians. Did you ever feel like my perspective on this is different from everyone else?
Well, I mean, I don't think that my background is different from any other Russian. I mean, I'm the child of my own generation, a child of my own country, and anybody who was born in 1979, sort of, in that part of the world, pretty much had to face the same joys and difficulties. We all lived through the 90s in Russia, we all remember that, and it's kind of that sort of broken generation that we kind of like, we know what it was, we know what it is, and we're kind of stuck in the middle. The millennials, the generation who was born sort of in the 90s, they have no idea what it was like. They're all happy listening to sort of Western music, whereas our generation remembers 89, remembers 91, remembers everything that the country was going through. And I personally, I was no different. I had to, my parents got divorced when I was young, so I had to kind of go out and start working when I was young. So I remember all that. And to answer your question, yes, absolutely, it's a huge part of my DNA. And to read the scenes, to approach the character, there isn't anybody who can play a Russian like a Russian, or to play a French like a French, or to play a Spanish like a Spanish. I mean, people can try, people can fake, people can get the accent to the T, but at the end of the day, they cannot think the thoughts of the character, therefore they cannot be that character. If you cannot be that character, then get out, give this job to somebody else. That's kind of how I look at it. So you kind of tap into that common DNA of your people that, when we shot in Moscow, for example, we have, background actors who are from Russia. You take this story where the story took place, and something happens to you.
Right.
It's like you just stand there. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to do anything. You just stand there and you just breathe the air that your character used to breathe. And you cannot buy that. That's what makes this show what it is this authenticity and this sort of strive to deliver realness versus let's pretend to be and let's, So I'll just leave it at that.
No, I actually found the Moscow scenes very realistic, particularly interaction with your family and things like that. And
Right.
What I saw for myself, I saw there. Yeah, very well done. Very well done.
Well, it's
Yeah.
it's these guys. They managed to find a way to go out there and shoot it, and I know it's like from it's been a long dream of yours for a number of years, a number of seasons, and then finally you guys were able to kind of make it happen, and we went there and we did it, and we, one of the few crews that actually got to shoot there and by the Kremlin, by Lubyanka, and standing there on the bridge and overlooking Kremlin. It's phenomenal. You cannot substitute that for anything. I mean, you can spend huge amounts of money building stages and this and that and the other, and fix it in post. You can't. You can't. You take actors there for one scene, game over.
Matthew, what about you?
I struggled, as you may well know, with counter-surveillance because arrogantly, for 30 years as an actor, your film or television, an enormous part of your job is to be completely aware of something, the camera, and then to utterly ignore it. So I thought, counter-surveillance, that's exactly what I've been doing for 30 years. But it's incredibly difficult. Because I remember that time you took us out into the street and you were like, nope, sorry, nope, sorry. You're like, nope, sorry. And then what would happen is, one of the biggest struggles for me with the show was landing the Americans in a place that was authentic but entertaining. And what happened so often, these directors were briefed so vigorously by you going, they must get the counter-surveillance right. Because we were doing these scenes and the director's like, oh no, I saw you looking. All right, okay, do it again. All right, do it again. And he goes, I didn't see anything. I was like, well, I did it. You just didn't see me do it. Well, do it again. No, I saw you then. I was like, why? Pick one. You can either see me doing the counter-surveillance or you look like I'm not doing anything, but I am. He's like, well, that's a bit dull. I was like, well, I don't know what to tell you. So yeah, counter-surveillance is always like, oh, on dead drops. They're like, oh, I saw you do it. I went, all right, do it again. I didn't see anything. No, well, pick one.
And then he became a director.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'll show you how it's done.
Yes, yes. Step aside, step aside.
Marty and Mark, there's a lot of violence in the show. Did you ever find yourselves in a dangerous life or death situation, violent situation? What about on the actual streets? We know there's a lot more in the show than in real life, but did you run into anything?
No, the only violence I encountered was the KGB when I was arrested, and that was more violent than I actually remembered. I was watching another show, and there was an interview of a KGB officer who had been at the site when I was arrested, and he said that I fought like a tiger, and I thought, well, I don't remember it that way. I remembered kicking a man, but he showed me the bruise on his shin. But this man elaborated, and he said, no, she really was fighting for her life, and she kicked a man who was then hospitalized and claimed he couldn't have sex for several months.
Yeah.
So
There's a picture of that in their museum, by the way.
Yeah. I would have never guessed that I had.
Amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
But see, I was on the giving end, so.
Good. Good.
Right.
Did you receive training in?
Not really.
Right.
I mean, I had taken karate, but it was only for my own entertainment, not for self-protection. I guess it kicked in.
Right, yes. Instinct, yeah, took
Yes,
over.
right.
Yes.
Amazing.
Mark, what about you?
There's a lot of shooting on the show.
Yes.
I've never fired a weapon at anybody, thank God. I've been shot at, but not, and that was in war zones. So, generally the experience is more psychological tension and strain than physical confrontation. Physical confrontations are very rare, again, in my experience, except war zones.
I think with Keri, I always knew when you were going to do it. I just knew, she's going to do it. She is.
You're like, stop talking.
How many
Yes.
notches
Stop
on
talking.
your pistol? How many notches on you've killed a lot of people.
Right.
A lot.
Or the knife. Both of you with the knife. You were
Oh yeah,
very
you get your share too.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Keri, I remember you saying that the sides of Elizabeth, you sort of like getting to do that stuff because really, you're a pretty nice person. It's fun to sort of get to do it fictionally.
So fun. Come on.
Don't we all want to do that?
So fun. Like, you know, my 6-year-old can boss me around in life. You know what I mean? On the show, like, I attack grown men.
Yeah, nobody's bossing you around on the show.
No one's bossing me around. Yeah, yeah. It's pretty fun.
Brian asks how accurate or real the Martha storyline is. You guys have heard me answer this one so many times. Does anybody want to take this one? All right, I'll do it.
You do
Yeah,
it.
Joe's gonna
You're
do
the
it.
best.
Yes.
Come on.
Basically, I was just talking to Joel Fields, my writing partner, about this one, that we were like, we think this is the best storyline in the Americans because you can't make up stuff as good as true stuff. You just can't, no matter what you try to do. The KGB, at least a couple times, actually had their officers marry
Right.
women who had access to secret intelligence, usually secretaries. This only happened in Europe. I don't think it ever happened in the United States, but secretaries of men in political positions, and these so-called Romeo spies, they would marry them and then use them to get intelligence. It's who would ever think of that? You'd be insane to think of that, but the KGB thought of it.
The East Germans used to use it quite a lot.
Yeah.
Marcus Wolf, who headed the East German intelligence, the so-called man without a face, they made a living on that, particularly against the West Germans when Germany was divided.
Well, they were known for their charm and romance. That's
They
why.
were just sweet fellas.
That was a no-brainer
They
for
were
them.
sweet fellas. Yeah.
Let's
And
use
Marcus
us.
Wolf was a sweetheart. Yeah.
By the way, it's a couple of the endings of those stories are known. In the ones I remember are in one case when a woman was confronted with the truth in a police station in, I think it was in West Germany. She literally, the second she found it out, jumped out the window of
Yeah.
the police station.
That's true.
Horrible. And then in another known case, there was absolutely nothing that could be done, no evidence that could be presented that would get the woman to believe it. It was just too
Amazing.
horrifying and painful. She just denied
Right.
everything and insisted that that was false, and this man loved her and she loved him. Tragic in a different way. Marty and Mark, as case officers, how do you keep the relationship between assets and yourself from getting too personal to the point where you could make a mistake or compromise yourself? What are the barriers or lines
Yeah.
that you put up?
I mean, this is something that is, of course, what one worries about. If you're the recruiting officer, there's a particular relationship between yourself and the person you've actually recruited to run as an agent. Of course, over the cycle of a case, let's say you have an agent who's going to work for a decade, hopefully, or more, there'll be a number of people who come in and handle. And CIA intentionally turns that relationship over to keep that distance. You want to avoid falling in love with your agent is what we talk about. And that's actually for the agent's own good and for the good of the officer. And that doesn't mean literally falling in love physically. It means being unable to see the flaws in the person, in the case, because you need to be able to see those in order to and protect the case and protect yourself. Yeah. So that it is a danger, though. People get too close to their agent, they become advocates for it, and that ultimately is a problem if that occurs.
I think there's a message in Morse code being flashlit to us. Were you?
Yes,
Were
we
you,
have-
or were you just playing with a flashlight?
No, that
See?
message.
As the non-member of the intelligence community on this stage,
You
I
caught the signal?
noticed it.
You're
Yes.
very good,
Yes.
very good observer.
That is the universal signal for that was the last question. So listen, I want to thank everyone, all our panelists. You guys are terrific. That was a lot of fun. Thank you
So
for
are
joining us
you.
today.
Thanks
Well,
for
thank
moderating,
Well,
Joe.
thank you.
Yes.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to the audience. It was great having you all here today.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you also to the Burkle Center for hosting us.
Here, here.
And thanks to FX Network, and thanks to the CIA. And please, everyone, remember to fill out your event surveys and hand them to the staff on the way out. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.